Someone asked me in a comment what I thought about what was going on with regard to the forthcoming 2020 presidential election. And I recorded a video about a year ago, which I'll link to in the comments below, predicting a year ago that Donald Trump would win re-election. And I think looking at things today, despite the pandemic, despite all the things happening related to the George Floyd case, I think that's true. As a matter of fact, I would go further. I would argue that I'm more confident about him being reelected today than I was about a year ago when I made the first video. Why? Why am I more confident now than I was then? One of the things I mentioned in the previous video, one of the reasons I thought Trump was going to win, was that despite what it looked like his position was in the polls, that they were probably much more favorable. And the reason for that is what's become known as, primarily, there are other things it's known as too, the Bradley effect. And let me go over the Bradley effect again. It was the 1982 California governor's race between Tom Bradley, who had been mayor of Los Angeles for several years, and he was an African American, against a white candidate, a Republican, George Deukmejian. And in that race, for the governorship, race became an issue because Bradley was black and Deukmejian was white. And there were people in the media and to some extent in the Bradley campaign talking about that some of the opposition to Bradley didn't have anything to do with his time as mayor of LA. It was because he was an African American and that race was playing an issue. Now, someone in the Deukmejian campaign actually believed, and from polling, began to think that people weren't answering the pollsters honestly when they were asking who they supported. Now, this became a press report, and then ultimately I think the guy was forced to resign or fired. I can't remember. But that's ultimately what happened. What happened was, people don't like to be called racists. Whether they're racist or they're not racist. Nobody wants to be called a racist. When you start insinuating that people's political positions are related to them being racist or are somehow racist, and then a pollster comes along and asks them who they're going to vote for, whether it's if it's a black candidate versus a white candidate, then there are some voters, likely voters, who will respond by lying. Because if for example, if it's a case of Bradley or Deukmejian, if they say, I'm going to vote for George Deukmejian, the pollster may think I'm a racist. So I'll tell them I'm going to vote for Tom Bradley. After all, it's a poll. It doesn't mean I have to actually vote for Tom Bradley. So in the polls, it looked like Bradley was going to win and win fairly easily. It was so bad in California that even in the exit polls, these are the polls that they take of people coming out after they voted. Somebody comes wandering out of a voting booth and you say, hey, who'd you vote for? And they were all saying Tom Bradley. So the voting in the exit polls were being reported as showing that Tom Bradley was going to win the election once the votes were finally counted. As it turned out, Tom Bradley lost. He lost narrowly, but in the polls, he should have won handily. And even in the exit polls, they were off. And this is what's known as the Bradley effect. That, if you have this kind of racial thing going on between the candidates, and there's a argument that if you don't support the black candidate, you're somehow a racist, that people will lie to pollsters. It doesn't mean they won't vote for the white candidate, but they'll lie about how they're going to vote with the pollsters. So that polls in racially charged times can often be inaccurate. Now, if you look at the situation, say a year ago when I recorded the previous video with regard to, racism and questions about the 2020 election, it's only gotten worse. The whole 3 years of the Trump administration, anybody who supported Trump was deemed a racist. If you voted for Trump, you must be a racist. If you support Trump's policies, you must be a racist. And if anything, it's gotten worse since the riots. The riots are going on and on and on. And if you don't support this or you don't support that or you don't support Black Lives Matter, and if you want to, clamp down on Antifa, and you're still supporting Donald Trump. I mean, after all, this is all Trump's fault. He created this racist environment, and that's why we had the killing of George Floyd and all the riots and all. If you don't support the opposition to Trump, you must be a racist. Now, it's not that Joe Biden's a black candidate this time, but you still have this element of race in there. And considering the fact that it's gotten worse rather than better over the last year, I would argue that you're probably going to see even more of a Tom Bradley effect, that people will continue to lie to pollsters, and when they get in there and they'll vote, they're going to vote for Donald Trump. The other thing that's going on, and there was a poll the other day that showed that as many as 40% of black likely voters, not African Americans polled in general, but African Americans who generally vote and are likely to vote, actually support Donald Trump. Now, this may seem crazy and totally beyond understanding if you look at what's happening with the riots and everything else. But that's only if you assume that, most African Americans like riots or want to see riots or want to see the stores in their neighborhoods burned down or looted or shut down and boarded up. And I think we've all seen videos, or maybe you haven't, maybe you don't pay attention to the news, of, poor people, a woman who didn't have a car, there's no public transportation, and the CVS was looted. And she can't get her prescriptions for her medications for, I forget what she had, diabetes or something. And she didn't know what she was going to do. Or people who can't get to the store, they have to walk to a store and the store has been looted. And there are all these stories. And there seems to be an assumption that, while black people are outraged by what happened to George Floyd, with good reason, I mean, not nobody's going to argue with them about that, that means that they all support, not just, I mean, I'm sure they do all support peaceful protests, but they support everything else that's been going on, no matter who you attribute it to. And that's simply not true. And if you go back and you look, and I've done this, you go back to the 1968 election when Richard Nixon beat Hubert Humphrey, which was after the 68 riots, which started in the spring and went into the summer, which were nationwide riots like these. They're the closest things we've had to what's happening now. What's happening now may even be worse, or maybe it's not as bad. I don't know. It'd be hard to determine. But if you go back and look, I mean, I think Goldwater got like 4% of the African-American vote in 1964. Richard Nixon got 12% of the African-American vote in the election in 1968. That was after the riots. In other words, if you look at the Republicans gaining African-American vote before the riots and after the riots, they did about 3 times as good after the riots. Now, one could very easily conclude from that the rioting that went on not only turned off a lot of white people, it turned off a lot of African Americans. Now, 12% of the African American vote is not, a huge amount. Although, keep in mind, this recent poll said that Trump may get as much as 40. Now, that's probably an exaggeration. But even if he gets 20, I mean, that would have a huge impact. I mean, just getting 12 in 68 was enough to help Richard Nixon get elected. And in 1972, he won 15% of the African-American vote. People forget this. They talk about the Southern strategy and Rick Nixon was a racist and all this. But Nixon did better with the African-American vote than his predecessors in the Republican Party, immediate predecessor at least, Barry Goldwater. And he did better than Ford. And he did, I don't know what Reagan got, but most of the Republicans running for president haven't broken into double digits. I mean, some get 8, 9 maybe. I think Trump got 8 in the last election. So if he could get 20 this time, I mean, you may be looking at a landslide, which is what Nixon got with 15 in 1972. It was just a total blowout, especially when you had an incoherent campaign waged by a far left Democrat, George McGovern. There's an old adage that, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And I think the Democrats are in that position. Because if you look at what's happening today, I think most of it, despite appearances, actually, in political terms, favors Donald Trump. If you look at the events that are happening today, the economy is improving. Unemployment's starting to drop as people go back to work. if you look at the pandemic, that seems to be waning. And that's a positive for Trump. If these riots end up causing, and protests, end up causing a new outbreak of COVID-19 because people aren't social distancing politically, that will help Trump. If it doesn't cause an outbreak of COVID-19, a renewed outbreak and a new surge of cases, that will help Trump, because then people are going to start questioning the lockdowns, much of which were pushed and enforced at the local level, especially and most strongly by Democrats. So that's not going to help him. And of course, if the riots continue, and they're already starting to change people's minds, be they white or black, about what's happening and what the Democrat position on all of this is, that will help Trump politically. And for the Democrats, I mean, the danger is real. People forget. Nixon became president in 1969 after the 68 election. Had he not screwed up with Watergate, which he didn't need to do those things. I mean, he was going to cruise to re-election in 1972. Let's face it, the guy was paranoid and had strange issues. I didn't vote for Richard Nixon. I voted for George McGovern, primarily because I knew McGovern would never win, but I just could not bring myself to vote for Richard Nixon. But if Nixon had not screwed up and had finished out his term, a Republican most likely would have been elected in 1976. There wouldn't have been a Jimmy Carter. I don't know who it would have been, but then we had Reagan. I mean, you could very easily come up with a situation where the Democrats lose the White House for 24 years, virtually a quarter of a century. And that could happen again. I mean, and I think that's the situation that they find themselves in today. The things just aren't going well for them. And they seem to be, as I say, progressives always do, they double down. They just keep going all in, and they just think if they just keep it up, something's going to happen. And, we still have all the stuff that's going to come out on what was going on with spying on Trump before the election. And all these investigations are going to be, releasing documents and things. And the only way that the Democrats right now can keep the focus off that is to, keep the riots, somehow find a way to keep the protests and riots going right up until the point of the election. And that's what happened in 1968. If you remember what happened at the Democrat convention in 1968 in Chicago, that did not help them win the presidency. So I think that they're in a really bad position, and that's why I think, Donald Trump's going to be reelected. So anyway, that's my take on what's happening. Again, I'll put a link to the video I did a year ago below, and we'll see what happens. We'll see how things develop. I know in the Rasmussen poll, the regular Rasmussen poll, Trump had bottomed out around 42% after the pandemic and the start of the riots. He was back up to 48%, I think, Friday. I don't know where he is today. These rolling polls go up and down all the time. But the trend right now is up. Stock market's going up, unemployment's going down, and I think that's where we're headed. It's going to be a Trump victory. I'm not predicting a landslide, and it's still plenty of time for something to go wrong. But right now, I think if the election were held today, Donald Trump would be reelected for a second term. So if you like my videos, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up, hit that notification button so you'll know when I post a new one. And if you would like to, leave a comment, something you'd like to see me talk about, leave that in the comment too. And until the next time, to quote Dennis Miller again, I'm out of here.